The Boy Who Stole the Blues. Quote, I slicked myself up till I looked like a guinea. End of quote. Carl Perkins, put your cat clothes on. For Carl Perkins and the rest of the rockabilly heroes, the liberation of the new music must have been a bit like a white foray into Darktown, a combination of a blackface minstrel show and night riding. Romantic as hell, a little dangerous, a little ridiculous. At the start, Elvis sounded black to those who heard him. When they called him the hillbilly cat, they meant the white Negro. Quote, the guy put out the record, end of quote. Elvis said on stage almost 15 years to the day after That's All Right was first played on the radio. Quote, just overnight my hometown people were saying, is he? Is he? And I'm going, am I? Am I? End of quote. Well, I can't hear that anymore. I hear a young man, white as the whale, who was special because in his best music he was so much his own man. One who took the musical and emotional strengths of the blues as a natural and necessary part of the world he was building for himself. One part of that world, no more, but clearly the finest stuff around at the time. True as it is in an historical or commercial sense, too much has been made of Elvis as, quote, a white man who sang black music credibly, end of quote, as a singer who made black music acceptable to whites. This, and too many whites trying to do the same thing, have corrupted any sense of what Elvis did do, of what was at stake in his personal culture. Most white blues singing is singing at the blues. What comes out is either entirely fake, or has behind it the white impulse to become black, to ask for too much without offering anything in return. Real white blues singers make something new out of the blues, as Jimmie Rodgers, Doc Boggs, Elvis, and Bob Dylan have. Or they sing out of a deep feeling for the blues, but in a musical style that is not blues, not formally anyway. But we can trace their strength to the blues. What links their music to the blues is an absolute commitment to the material, an expressive force open to some whites because they have been attracted to another man's culture in a way that could not be denied. This is the music of whites not so much singing the blues as living up to them. Van Morrison's Listen to the Lion would have to be my best example, but Rod Stewart and Charlie Rich have done their work here too, singing as if the fate of the whole world rested on their ability to reach deeply enough into their souls to get all the way into ours. I saw Rich do it not so long ago in a setting so anachronistic he came near to leaving his audience behind him because they were in a mood to be confirmed, not moved. It was in August 1973 at a country music affair sponsored by Columbia Records, attended mostly by record industry heavies and hangers-on. Singer after singer took the stage, offering songs that made pain trivial and good times bland. Music as sterile as it was predictable as it was. Music as sterile as it was predictable as it was within a tight, well-regulated country market, commercially effective. The producers and song publishers and publicists sat near the stage, waiting for the singers to humble themselves before them. And as each did, I thought the humility might be worth a lot more if it were cynical than if it were real. It was that kind of day. I yearned for some rock and roll arrogance, no matter how fake that might be. Charlie Rich, who has always had too much of the blues in his style to fit easily into the country music market, was riding a number one country single that had, because it was more than country, crossed over into the upper reaches of the pop charts. He closed the show, 40 years old, a big man with white hair and lines deep in his face. He took his seat behind the piano and sang a harmless tune from his current album. After almost 20 years in the music business, he had only 3 hits to show for it, even as Behind Closed Doors was climbing. The clerk in the record store marked up my Charlie Rich album under, quote, nostalgia, end of quote. The song Rich's wife Margaret Ann wrote about him, a haunting ballad of failure called Life's Little Ups and Downs, tells the truth of Rich's career. But that day at the convention, the crowd's truth was that Rich was on top and would stay there. Right as they may have been, I could not believe it was more than a public moment in an invisible career. And that made each song more precious and each missed chance that much more depressing. Rich sang his hit and it had grown for him. It meant more now than it had when it was just another throw of the dice, and it was a triumph. Because Rich was the star of the day, the men running the show gave him an encore. Staring into the keys, trying to balance the moment, Rich introduced his song. "I wrote this for Peter Guralnick," he said, "who wrote the book Feel Like Going Home." Named for the most terrifyingly lonely of all Muddy Waters songs, it is probably the most loving book ever written about American music. Charlie Rich is the subject of its finest chapter. Today, Rich said, "I would like to dedicate this song to the President of the United States." And so for Nixon, just then slipping over the line to the point where his whole existence would become a national joke, Rich sang, "I tried and I failed and I feel like going home." The words stayed in my mind throughout the strange, difficult song. They didn't change the president or the country or the world, but they changed how a few of us who were there to listen understood those things. They cut through everything I believed to uncover a compassion that I never wanted to feel. We won't find Elvis here. The idea that the blues is a feeling and not a form can bring us closer to what Rich did that afternoon. But for Elvis, the blues was a style of freedom, something he couldn't get in his own home, full of roles to play and rules to break. In the beginning, the blues was more than anything else a fantasy, an epic of struggle and pleasure that he lived out as he sang. Not a fantasy that went beneath the surface of his life, but one that soared right over it. Singing in the 50s, before blacks began to guard their culture with the jealousy it deserved, Elvis had no guilty dues to pay. Arthur Crudup complained his songs made a white man famous, and he had a right to complain, but mostly because he never got his royalties. Elvis sang "That's All Right" and "My Baby Left Me," one of his first sides for RCA and the only one in the Sun rockabilly style, with more power, verve, and skill than Crudup did. His early records were more than popular with blacks, but still the implication always there when Crudup or Willie Mae Thornton, who made the first version of Hound Dog, looked out at the white world that gave them only obscurity in exchange for their music and pinned them off from getting anything for themselves, is that Elvis would have been nothing without them, that he climbed to fame on their backs. It is probably time to say that this is nonsense. The mysteries of black and white in American music are just not that simple. Consider the tale of Hound Dog. Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller were Jewish boys from the East Coast who fell in love with black music. Hustling in Los Angeles in the early 50s, they wrote Hound Dog and promoted the song to Johnny Otis, a ruling R&B band leader who was actually a dark-skinned white man from Berkeley who many thought was black. Otis gave the song to Thornton, who made it a #1 R&B hit in 1953. Otis also took part of the composer's credit, which Leiber and Stoller had to fight to get back. Elvis heard the record, changed the song completely from the tempo to the words, and cut Thornton's version to shreds. Whites wrote it, a white made it a hit, and yet there is no denying that Hound Dog is a black song, unthinkable outside the impulses of black music, and probably a rewrite of an old piece of juke joint fury that dated back far beyond the birth of any of those people. Can you pull justice out of that maze? What does Huck owe Jim? Especially when Jim is really Huck in blackface and everyone smells loot. All you can say is this was Elvis's music because he made it his own. Here's a better story. In 1955, the Robins, a black vocal group that had passed through 7 labels with no real success, and Richard Berry, a black singer with 2 duds to his name, were brought together by Leiber and Stoller. Together they made the classic Riot in Cell Block No. 9, which helped change the Robins into the Coasters and brought Berry his first notoriety. Leiber and Stoller went on to fame and fortune, and the Coasters at least to fame. Berry, after losing out with The Big Break, an outrageous follow-up to Riot, made Louie Louie in 1956, but though it was his biggest hit, it never made the pop charts. In 1962, a white Portland group called the Kingsmen unearthed Louie Louie, and their version hit number 2 in the country. Paul Revere and the Raiders, another Portland band, rode the tune into a gold mine on the West Coast. As rock records, these discs were virtually definitive. Hard rhythm, harder lead guitar, and a vocal that made no sense whatsoever. Within months, every high school band in the country was playing Louie Louie, and every other person you met had a copy of the real lyrics, which were reputedly obscene. Some highlights I recall from locker room days: gonna make her again, gonna rag on, Fuck that girl across the sea. Not much, I admit, but those were thin years for rock and roll. Soon even congressmen got into the act. They investigated the tune, duly played it at 45, 33, 78, and 16 RPM, and charmingly pronounced the song indecipherable at any speed. By this time, everyone but the man who owned the copyright, and likely he too, had forgotten all about Richard Berry, whose original lyrics would have been beside the point anyway. Ten years later, a white New York group called Stories released a single called Brother Louie, and the record went to number 1. Louie, Louie, Lou-I went the chorus. Familiar to say the least. Obviously, the chorus was what caught your attention. It always had been, since rock and roll had been around long enough for its fans to develop a sense of history. A few people remembered Richard Berry, and what was this new Louie Louie about? A black girl and her white boyfriend, Louie, and his mean racist parents. Quote, ain't no difference if you're black or white, end of quote, Stories sang. Quote, brothers, you know what I mean, end of quote. But this time, the brother was white. And finally, the old song contained the racial contradictions that had sustained it. If Elvis drew power from black culture, he was not exactly imitating blacks. When he told Sam Phillips he didn't sing like nobody, he told the truth. No white man had so deeply absorbed black music and transformed it since Jimmie Rodgers. Instead of following Rodgers' musical style, as so many good white singers had, Lefty Frizzell, Ernest Tubb, Tommy Duncan, and in his more personal way, Hank Williams, following that style until it simply wore out, Elvis followed Rodgers' musical strategy and began the story all over again. Elvis didn't have to exile himself from his own community in order to justify and make real sense. Elvis didn't have to exile himself from his own community in order to justify and make real his use of an outsider's culture, like the Jewish jazz man Mezz Mezzrow, who would claim that his years on the streets of Harlem had actually darkened his skin and thickened his lips, like Johnny Otis and so many real white Negroes. As a Southerner and white trash to boot, Elvis was already outside. In 1955, he had at least as much in common with Bobby Bland as he did with Perry Como, which is to say that Elvis was also hell-bent on the mainstream, and sure enough of himself to ignore the irony that it would be his version of the backdoor freedoms of black music that would attract the mainstream to him, giving him the chance to exchange his hillbilly strangeness for acceptability. Elvis's blues were a set of sexual adventures, and as a blues-singing swashbuckler, his style owed as much to Errol Flynn as it did to Arthur Crudup. It made sense to make movies out of it. The Pink Cadillac. By the time Baby Let's Play House came out in April 1955, the rockabilly singers were coming out of the swamps. Phillips was shifting his company from black to white, setting up an outbreak of rock and roll that would follow hard on Presley's already discussed and taken for granted move up to a national label. Phillips had Malcolm Yelvington, a Memphis country singer endowed with false teeth and the best rockabilly name outside of Elvis's, cut the first of many country rock versions of Stick McGee's 1949 R&B classic Drinkin' Wine, Spo-D-O-D, and its message summed up the new mood. Drinking and fighting are what life is all about, and if anybody argues, give them a drink or lay them out. Elvis had finished his early tours ranging from Texas to Florida. He was set for Cleveland, alien territory, crucial to proving himself outside the South. And he was booked with acts as disparate as Roy Acuff and Pat Boone. The Colonel had made his initial connections. In Lubbock, Texas, a kid named Charles Buddy Holly bowed to the east every night and began getting a band together. There was, to put it mildly, excitement in the air. Elvis's dive into Baby Let's Play House, a wild crash of hiccups, gulps, and babies, measured perfectly the distance he had traveled since he broke into tears at the sight of his first record. There is a new spirit here, a lightness and a sense of fun, as if his whole little career had suddenly hit him as a wonderful joke. The dreams are coming true. That drive and secret ambition can afford to open up. He knows now that his mother was right and he is safe. That throwaway superiority for which he has worked so hard can blossom out into arrogance, humor, and pure good times. What was it his mother told him? That he was just as good as anybody? Or did she whisper late at night when no one else was there to hear that her boy could never lose? Arthur Gunter, a black singer working for the Excello label in Nashville, wrote and recorded Baby Let's Play House and got a hit with the black market in early '55. He used a tight acoustic band and walked right through, vaguely interested in telling his girl that she might think she's hot stuff, but she'd better come on back and get down to it, or there'd be, trouble. It was all very low-key. That splendid intro was all Elvis. Gunter's lack of concern was his charm. Still, he didn't sound very convincing. Elvis wailed. He turned the song into a correspondence course in rock and roll, and it was by far the most imitated of his first records. For pure excitement, he may never have matched it. The rhythm was heavy, the syncopation astonishing, a fast, ominous bass tromping over a cottonmouth guitar. The band drove hard into every chorus and cut off for all the best lines. "Oh, let's play house," Elvis shouted. And Scotty punched out a few riffs. "Hit it," Elvis cried. And Moore and Black rammed home music so tough it wasn't touched until Elvis pushed them into the earthquake that was Hound Dog. Elvis made one crucial change in the lyrics. The girl he's after in this song is high-class stuff. She might go to college, he sings, but she might go to school, but she'll never really get away, never be so sure of herself she can get along without the loving only he can give her. She might even get religion, Gunter had added, which won't help her either, but Elvis threw in a faster, flashier image that was more to his own point. "You may have a pink Cadillac, but don't you be nobody's fool." Elvis had just bought one for himself. Now, the obvious thing to say here is that the pink Cadillac and all that it implied proved Elvis's undoing. Out there in mass culture America, Elvis would lose his talent and its reward. Don't you be nobody's fool? The poor boy should have taken his own advice. Well, we should be careful about this sort of thing. There's a deep need to believe that Elvis, for any exemplar of American culture one cares about, began in a context of purity, unsullied by greed or ambition or vulgarity, somehow outside of and in opposition to American life as most of us know it and live it. Even RCA first presented Elvis as a folk singer, claiming in the notes to his second album that the simple country boy with guitar stance pictured on the cover was most appropriate for him. A writer as tough and sensitive as Stanley Booth can write in a piece that seems to miss the point of its own title, "A Hound Dog to the Manor Born." Quote, "All that was really necessary was that Elvis stop doing his thing and start doing theirs. His thing was Mystery Train, Milk Cow Blues Boogie. Theirs was Love Me Tender, Loving You, Jailhouse Rock, King Creole." End of quote. Charlie Gillette, author of The Sound of the City, as definitive a history of rock and roll as we are likely to get, complains that Elvis sold out his true culture when he let RCA put drums on his records. It is virtually a critical canon that Elvis's folk purity, and therefore his talent, was ruined by A, his transmogrification from naive country boy into corrupt pop star. He sold his soul to Colonel Tom, or Parker just stole it. B, Hollywood. C, the army. D, money and soft living. E, all of the above. This Faustian scenario is an absolutely vital part of Elvis's legend, especially for all those who took part in Elvis's event and felt bewildered and betrayed by his stagnation and decline. We could hardly believe that a figure of such natural strength could dissolve into such a harmless nonentity. It had to be some kind of trick. Even a decade after the fact, Phil Spector was convinced that Colonel Parker hypnotized Elvis. This approach may contain some figures, but not Elvis. Milk Cow Blues was not his thing, it was one of many, so much as it was Sam Phillips's. Phillips loved money and he loved the blues. The basic pop combination pairing a blues and a country tune on Elvis's first record gave him a successful commercial formula, and he stuck to it on every subsequent Presley release and on most of the records he cut by other rockabilly singers. But when Elvis left Memphis to confront a national audience as mysterious to him as he was to it, he had to define himself fully, and he did so by presenting his authentic multiplicity in music. "I am," he announced, "a house rocker, a boy steeped in mother love, a true son of the church, a matinee idol who's only kidding, a man with too many rough edges for anyone ever to smooth away. Something in me yearns for a settling of affairs," he said with his pale music and his tired movies. On the other hand, he answered with his rock and roll and an occasional blues. "I may break away at any time. You never know." At RCA, where the commercial horizons were much broader than they were down at Sun, Elvis worked with far more artistic freedom than he ever did with Sam Phillips. Two things did happen that led to the collapse of Elvis's music. His multiplicity opened up the possibility that he could be all things to all people, but his eagerness to prove it with records like Something for Everybody destroyed his ability to focus his talent. He wound up without a commitment to any musical style. His music lost that dramatic shape Sam Phillips helped to give it. And his ambition, the source of so much of the intensity and emotion he put into his early music, plainly outstripped itself. 2 years after making his first record, he had won more than anyone knew was there. He had achieved a status that trivialized struggle and made will obsolescent. His success turned his life upside down. From this point on, he would have in his hands what he set out to get, but he would have to reach for the energy and desire that had made his triumph possible.